So this is the concepts of demand and supply. I now want to show you how you can use this in a way that can profoundly affect public policy. Our government has had a war on drugs since I was in high school. It's continuing. I think more than half of the people incarcerated in California are there on drug charges. And yet, what I would hope to convince you or explain to you is that this war on drugs could be known to be doomed to failure just using basic concepts of demand and supply. Demand and supply concepts shows that it is necessarily going to fail. It can't operate correctly. Or better yet, the more effective the war on drug is at incarcerating people and reducing the supply of drugs, the more it's going to exacerbate the problem of drugs in the economy. Okay? This is something, again, that, well, it's just using the concepts of supply and demand that provide this implication without any empirical analysis, actually, except one little thing. Okay, so let's draw the demand and supply of drugs and then see what the drug program is trying to do. Okay? The demand for drugs, I've drawn it here. The one thing that is important to the analysis is that I've drawn it steeply. What that means is if you're at a particular price for drugs and you raise the price, people are going to still pretty much continue buying the drugs. For addiction drugs like heroin, cocaine, meth, the price could go high and people still are going to buy it. Okay? So there's going to be a relatively small diminution in the number of people, quantity demanded, as the price rises. So the demand curve, I think we can all agree, is relatively steep. There's been a lot of empirical work with this. Same is true for cigarettes. Okay? So then let's draw in the supply curve. It really doesn't matter how we draw it in. I'm just going to put it in here. The shape of it doesn't matter that much to the analysis. The steepness of the demand curve does matter. Okay, so now what we end up with is, in the absence of a war on drugs, if we just let things be as they would in a naturally occurring market, we have a demand curve and we got a supply curve. These are people supplying the drugs. These are people buying the drugs. You get some equilibrium price, and you get a price and quantity at that equilibrium. Importantly, for the analysis I'm going to describe, this box here, this square, this rectangle, is a graphical representation of the amount of money that is transacted in the drug trade. This is the price times the quantity. Remember your basic geometry that the area of a rectangle is the height times the width? Well, the height is price and the width is quantity, and so this right here, the area of that rectangle, is the quantity of money that's spent on drugs. It's the quantity of money that the drug sellers obtain as revenue and the quantity of money that the buyers have to come up with to buy it. Okay? So now, what is the effect on the war of drugs? The purpose of the war on drugs was to tempt drugs from entering the country and to imprison drug dealers. And the point of this was to reduce the supply of drugs. The point of reducing the supply was twofold. There's always been two parts of this program. One, we think that people should not be using drugs. It's harmful to themselves. There's that aspect. But actually, the bigger aspect from a political perspective is that the tremendous amount of violence and crime that's associated with the drug trade. The drug sellers have cartels and have enormous bloody battles over who's going to control the drug trade. And the drug buyers often have to engage in crime to be able to pay for the drugs that they're getting. Okay? That's one reason the demand curve is relatively steep. If the price goes up, people that are severely addicted will do what's needed to get the money to buy the drugs. Okay? So the point of the drug program was to reduce people's individual use of the drug, but also to reduce these problems associated with the drug trade. Okay? What is that going to do? We can then say, suppose the drug program is actually successful in its reduction in supply, that it actually incarcerates people, prevents drugs from coming across the border, other things like that. What that does is decrease the supply curve. Okay? So the supply curve drops from its original level to its new level. Okay? And what is the impact of that? The impact is moving from the old equilibrium to a new equilibrium. Okay? And notice, the two things that we're wanting to accomplish, this is the new amount of money that's being spent on drugs after the war on drugs has occurred. So what's happened is the amount of drugs that are actually being sold drops exceedingly little. So we don't have much impact on the amount of people actually consuming drugs, and the amount of money that is spent on drugs, that is the source of the violence for people buying the drugs and those who are selling the drugs, has actually increased. We now have more money in the drug trade than we had to start with. It's an inevitable outcome of this situation. Yeah. Right. This is because the demand curve is exceedingly steep. If the demand curve is steep, the main impact of reducing supply is going to be increasing the price. You can think of it as the original equilibrium is here, and this amount of money is spent on drugs. What happens is you incarcerate a lot of people, stop the drug from coming into the country, the supply drops to here, and there's a shortage. What happens with a shortage? The people who have the drugs then can raise the price, make a lot of more money. The people who are wanting to buy the drugs are offering to buy it, sell it to me, I'll pay more money. That causes the price to go up. And notice what happens when the price goes up. When the price goes up, the supply increases because now it becomes more profitable. Whatever people were willing to incur as a risk of getting caught, whatever profit was necessary for to incur the original risk, now the risk is higher, but if you raise the profits, the same trade-off is being made. They now become willing to incur, more people are willing to incur the risk, the increased risk, to supply the drugs. Eventually, price rises high enough to where this quantity provided is practically the same as it was before, just slightly lower. What has happened is the government has increased the cost of supplying drugs such that the prices had to rise sufficiently to warrant people still supplying the same quantity as they had before. So what's happened is we've just incurred a cost on the supply side, which is then borne by the people who buy the drugs, and increase the total amount of money being spent in the market. So the amount of violence actually goes up. Now, the only way you could get out of this, if you truly believe in the war on drugs, is to say that the demand curve is not steep. But I don't think there's anyone who believes the demand curve for drugs is not steep. That you raise the price, people will just quit doing it. Oh, I'll just quit. No empirical research has shown that. So what this shows is, we could have known this beforehand if the people in our government had just taken this class, and then we could save all this money. So what do you do instead? If you have a demand and supply system like this, and you know the supply interactions, the supply effect is going to be the wrong direction, it's going to hurt things. Your other option, you've got two levers, supply and demand. Education and rehabilitation programs to reduce the the demand curve. When you reduce the demand curve, price necessarily goes down. The opposite of what reducing the supply curve does. So you start out with this amount of money right here being spent, and if your program is effective in the sense of shifting demand curve, then you actually solve your problem. Okay? Now, just a second. There's one problem with this, of course, is what if your program's not effective at, you could be throwing money down the drain but not being able to reduce the demand curve. The difference on these two arguments is if the drug program is successful in shifting the supply curve, it necessarily makes things worse. So it's one of those things that if you succeed, you necessarily lose. The demand curve, if you're successful, at least you're going to win. So either don't do anything or do it that way.